Captured. Thomas was frustrated. In the days following his adventure at the mulberry tree, he had many opportunities to study the map and the paper that was with it, and he was in no way able to make any sense of it. Judging from the way the coastline appeared, the map seemed that it could be somewhere on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, but there were many other places which could have the same kinds of inlets. None of the creeks and the inlets were labeled. It was just a map of a complicated coastline. There was something strange about the coastline, too, something he couldn't quite identify. For some reason, something about it did not look right or natural. He was frustrated for another reason also. The weeks until the return of the prudent Hannah went by with an aching slowness, and the humid Maryland summer made everything seem a little slower. Still, this gave him time to think a good deal about what he should do with his map when he went to sea. He had finally decided not to tell his mother about it, because he couldn't imagine anything they could do about the difficulty that wouldn't endanger them both. He also decided that if he figured the map out or had any ideas on how to do something about it, that he would tell her then. In the meantime, Thomas decided to spend the time he had until he went to sea studying the map and the paper, committing them both to memory. He would be able to hide the oilskin pouch at home easily enough, and if anything came up on his journey where he had to have the map, he would be able to draw it again. And so he spent his afternoons studying, just as he had done before. He was accustomed to study, and it was not long before he had them both committed to memory. This was harder than his usual lessons had been, because with this map and code he had no idea what anything meant, but it was still something he was able to do within a week's time. He then made sure of himself, reviewing the map and the strange ciphers in his mind every day, and after several weeks he was comfortable knowing that he could draw both out by hand. Day followed day, and finally enough time had passed for Thomas to start running down to the docks every afternoon to see if the prudent Hannah had arrived, or if there was any news of her. He would walk along the docks first to see what new ships had arrived, and after he was disappointed, he would go see Mr. Jenkins at his warehouse. "No news, laddie. Maybe tomorrow." And Thomas would tip his hat and walk back up the hill toward home. But waiting does have this reward. When the thing you are waiting for finally comes, all the hours spent waiting for it are all gathered up at once and rushed to your chest, and they make it hard to breathe. At least it was this way for Thomas. One afternoon, just after he had eaten a simple lunch of oat cakes, he walked down to the docks, trying hard to expect nothing. But one of the first things he saw was a strange sloop tied up on her starboard side with her bow pointed out to the river. He broke into a trot as soon as he saw her, and ran until he could see the name spelled out on the stern, Prudent Hannah. He veered off and ran to Mr. Jenkins' warehouse, and when he arrived there, blowing a little, Mr. Jenkins smiled a grim little smile. "Here's your letter, lad, but I warned ye about the work. Captain Monroe was in here this morning lamenting his shipworms terrible like. After we are done offloading his cargo, said he was going down to the South River to careen his ship, but he told me he was looking for good hands. He lost some in Jamaica and some more this morning when he docked." Thomas took the letter, thanked Mr. Jenkins several times, and walked quickly out the wide door of the warehouse. When he got to the sloop, he stopped at the gangway and waited nervously until the mate came over to the rail. "Permission to come aboard?" His voice didn't quiver, for which Thomas was very grateful, but his mouth was dry, and the palms of his hands were sweaty. "Come aboard, eh?" the mate said, and Thomas made his way up the gangway. He said he had a letter from Mr. Jenkins, asked to see the captain, and followed the first mate as he led the way to captain's quarters. He swallowed many times on the way there, trying to remember the things he ought to say, and hoping he wouldn't say anything stupid. He told his mother that night that he would be going with the prudent Hannah in the morning to begin working on cleaning the ship, but that they would be back in harbor within a week or so. Captain Monroe had already made arrangements with Mr. Jenkins for a full cargo of tobacco, and so they would come back to load up, and then they would sail for Jamaica. Captain Monroe had treated him politely enough, but had promised him nothing. "If you work as Mr. Jenkins says, then you may sail with me. But if you shirk, or if you stand around waiting for someone to box your ear, I'll bring you back here and you can explain to Mr. Jenkins why you made a liar out of him." Thomas had worked far harder than anyone expected, including himself, and was grateful after 2 days of it when the mate took him aside and jokingly told him not to make the other hands look bad. The work did not require any peculiar training, and once you had the hang of it, the only thing to do was work hard or not. Thomas labored away methodically until his hands blistered and bled, and he slept very well every night. Careening a ship means tilting the ship in shallow water on her heel sharply to starboard and repairing and caulking portions of the hull normally below the waterline. The crew scrapes barnacles, cleans weeds, looks for shipworm, and caulks anything they need to with oakum and pitch. Then the whole thing is done over again, listing to port. The only trouble Thomas had during that time was once when the first mate told him to scramble down below into the smallest hole in the aft of the ship and bring back a chisel the mate had left there. Thomas jumped to it, but stopped suddenly when he came to the small entry of the hold. Peering down inside, he saw that it was dark and wet, and there could scarcely be any room for turning around. Since he had been a small boy, Thomas had been deathly afraid of closed and dark spaces. His mother didn't know what to make of it, and neither did Thomas. But there it was, and here he was, needing to get a tool just a few feet away in a dark hold. He couldn't go down into the hold, and he couldn't go back and lie to the mate. Thomas just stood there for what seemed like hours to him, but it was actually just a few moments. He was breathing deeply, and the palms of his hands were clammy. Then, suddenly, like spring after winter, the mate's voice came floating over the deck. "Never you mind, laddie. Found it in my belt." Thomas had never heard better tidings in his life. When the ship returned to harbor 10 days later, Thomas walked up to his home, gratified at the report he could give his mother. The captain had commended him and brought him into his crew. He knew his mother would be sad that he was going to sail, but that she would have been disappointed in an even deeper way if he had failed at his work. If he had taken on his employment as Isaac Taylor would have, he could have come home to stay for a time, but with no pay to give her but excuses. Excuses make for thin soup, Sarah had often told her son when he was little. When they had finished their dinner that evening, Sarah Ingold told Thomas to sit on the edge of his bed. She then disappeared into her room and returned carrying a very small sea chest. "I am sorry it is so small," she said, "but it was all I could afford. Now, go on, open it." Thomas turned the latch, lifted the lid, and inside was a change of clothes, suitable for the sea, a pair of shoes, a few small cakes she had made for him, and a prayer book. "Thomas," she said, "your mother will pray for you, and so you must pray for your mother." Thomas promised, thanked her again, and then they both sat quietly, not knowing what to say, and not needing to say anything. The ship pulled away from the dock at dawn. Sarah stood on the docks, next to Mr. Jenkins, and they both waved as the sloop pulled away from the dock. Thomas had time to wave briefly, but even though he was an inexperienced hand, the first mate had him scurrying around the deck, hauling in lines and coiling them. When he was done with that, the dock was far astern, and he could not even make out any figures on it. Thomas could feel the swell of the water beneath his feet, and the salt air he had breathed his whole life seemed completely different to him now. The sloop was a smart one and rolled evenly beneath him, and a whiff of salt spray enchanted him. He had never been so excited. It was a beautiful day, and the breeze off the bay buffeted his face. He was very happy. The first mate, whose name was Alfred, came by a moment later and said, "Come over here, laddie." Thomas followed him curiously over to the port side of the ship, where Alfred showed him the coils of line there. "Now, do these look anything like the fouled rat nests you made over there on the starboard side?" "No, sir," Thomas said. "What are you going to do about it, then?" "Aye, aye," Thomas said, and ran back over to starboard to coil the line again. This took him about half an hour. He had to run back and forth to see what the line was supposed to look like, and when he was done, he reported back to the mate, who then put him to work on a number of basic tasks. And whenever he thought he had nothing to do, he was a holy stone to the deck. Kent Island and the Choptank River were barely visible to port, and the leagues slid swiftly beneath the keel. They were making their way to the Virginia Capes, with the hope that they could put in at the York River to load their final provisions of water before making their way out to sea. Once they were past the Capes, the captain wanted to sail clear south, not putting in anywhere, proceeding as fast as he could. If the winds were fair, he could sell his cargo in Jamaica and return to Annapolis by September. Several days passed in this way, and while the weather stayed pleasant, the chop of the waves picked up. Thomas was very grateful that he did not appear to be sensitive to seasickness. "Bred to the sea," his mother had said. The Prudent Hannah was a small merchant sloop and had no artillery. So after 3 days, when a strange sail appeared in the distance off their port bow, Captain Monroe tacked hard to starboard. "The eastern shore is a true hive for sea rovers," he muttered to himself. "Does he mean pirates?" Thomas asked one of the other hands. "Aye," was the reply. "Pirates, rogues, knaves, and every manner of sneaking puppy." "All hands on deck," the captain roared. "If he tacks to follow us, we make a run for the Patuxent, and everyone look alive." The first mate clambered up into the rigging, glass in hand. A few moments later, he bellowed down at them, "She's coming about!" In a moment, Captain Monroe had the Crow throw every sail up, and the sloop quickly bent before a favoring breeze. At first, Captain Monroe had wanted to make the mouth of the Patuxent, although it became quickly apparent that the strange vessel would be able to head them off. But it also became evident that Prudent Hannah had a much shallower draft than the other ship, and so the captain changed his plan and began hoping to take refuge among the many shoals that lined the shores of the bay. At the captain's command, the mate had several of the crew go below and stave in the water barrels in the hope of making the draft shallower still. In desperation, he ordered the helmsman to turn a couple of points nearer the wind. However, this run for the shoaly water was clear to the pirate captain as well, and before Thomas had much time to reflect on what was occurring, the other ship had managed to cross their bow and fired one small swivel gun from her rail as a warning. Captain Monroe was no coward, but he had no guns, and hence no opportunity to swing the sloop around to offer a broadside. All he had was the futility of possible musket fire, and so he ordered the boatswain to strike the colors. This was done, and the crew of the Prudent Hannah waited gloomily for 2 longboats from the pirate ship to arrive. This they did soon enough. The pirate sloop was about 60 tons and had 8 guns. A blood-red flag flew above her, and she was named the Lady Constance. Thomas stood with the other sailors in a group and watched in horror as the pirates strolled around the deck of the Prudent Hannah. Most of the crew were appalled at the simple insolence of the robbers, but Thomas had other concerns. The leader of the boarding party was O'Connor, the man who had buried the map. One of the things pirates often did on their raids was recruit from the crews of their prizes. But Captain Monroe had picked his men well. They were all honest men, and all shook their heads when the offer to turn pirate was given to them. They knew well enough that whenever an honest man was turned from seamanly behavior, the pirates would take care to involve him quickly in some awful crime so that there would be no turning back for him, and he would come to the end of his days decorating a gibbet. The captured crew stood in a close knot on the quarter deck, Thomas standing in the middle of them. Several of the pirates stood guard over them all, while the other pirates ran over the ship, laughing and shouting. They went alow and aloft, taking everything of value they could find. The captain's silver, 11 pipes of wine, cable, extra rigging, and some casks of rum. But the cargo itself was mostly tobacco, and the pirates did not want to be troubled transferring it to the Lady Constance, so it was decided to keep the sloop as a prize. "What are they going to do with the tobacco?" Thomas asked the crewman next to him. "There are some honest merchants on the eastern shore who have more business with pirates than they should have," he answered simply. "I call them honest out of Christian charity," he added, and then was silent. When the frenzy of pillage was over, the pirate boarding party assembled in front of the prisoners again. Thomas licked his lips nervously. He knew there was no way O'Connor would know him, but that did not change the sensation that Thomas had that he ought to know him. Thomas had watched him commit 2 murders, and he had had a hard time imagining that O'Connor could not know the one who had seen him. But the pirate walked by Thomas several times and took no particular notice of him. Because the thieving was over, O'Connor beckoned to Captain Monroe to step forward. "Have you seen what we have done?" O'Connor asked. "I have seen the mischief," the captain replied. "By the powers," O'Connor said in mock anger, "you call it mischief? We are merely small nations, and do to ships what France does to England, and England to France. Mischief! Why do you not call us patriots, instead of desperate fellows?" Captain Monroe decided it would be futile to answer, and so he remained quiet. Besides, he had sometimes wondered the same thing himself. Not that he would ever justify piracy, but he sometimes had wondered how much piracy under another guise sustained and stained the honest intercourse of Christian nations.